Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. Today we're going to look at a past but also future problem, and that has to do with the collapse of public leadership in reference to an increasingly important climate crisis globally. The collapse is not just in the United States, but it is pretty pronounced in the United States. It's general across the industrial world, and in fact in the world at large. Never before has humanity received such a direct series of warnings from the scientists that have been amplified just this week in a new report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But in almost every country, public leadership has stepped back from the problem, pretending it doesn't exist, or, in any case, not doing anything effective to address the issues. So we're going to be looking at the collapse of public leadership and the rise of a citizen scientist alliance for climate survival that's beginning to emerge around the world and take on a crucial importance in the vacuum left by public leadership on all continents, in all countries. It became apparent very clearly to Americans in the highly staged departure from the Paris Global Accord by President Trump, addressing a hand-picked audience in the Rose Garden. He put it not very eloquently, but rather crudely, to the public. Take a look.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. Thank you. But begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out.
That's it. So we're getting out. It's as if we're saying, okay, we're checking out from the planet. We're getting out. What are we getting out of? Well, it'd be an interesting thing to look at. In fact, a lot of reporters did look at it at the time and fact-checked his speech. Because he rambles on and on about things that are unrelated to the climate accord at all. It's not clear he even read it when he wants to reject it. He loves the applause from people in the oil and coal industries, the fracking concerns, that are trying to get rid of restrictions and go full steam ahead on the use of the fossil fuels that they have in the ground. But the speech was filled with misunderstandings and deliberate falsifications. A number of news agencies looked at that at the time. In fact, a fact-checking undertaken by Time magazine just went through it sort of statement by statement and pointed out that it was just plain wrong. As did HBO. HBO put out a number calling Trump got climate change pretty wrong in his Paris speech. But it doesn't seem to matter to this leadership. They seem to be able to convince themselves that by scoring points on the issue with eager sellers of fossil fuels, that they can win the climate crisis by winning over a few more votes of a few more billionaires. Very short-sighted and rather embarrassing. It's particularly problematic in the light of the latest scientific findings that are now coming out from the IPCC. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just issued a report indicating that what we thought was a voluntary aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade increase is in fact now a mandatory upper limit on what civilization can survive. If it goes above that to 2 degrees centigrade, there's going to be enormous dislocations. This is the report that was just released in the second week here in October in a meeting in Korea, and it's now worldwide and available on the web. Take a look at its findings. It's really quite amazing.
The United Nations Climate Panel warns in a new report humanity has only a dozen years to mitigate climate change or face global catastrophe with severe droughts, floods, sea level rise, and extreme heat set to cause mass displacement and poverty. The landmark report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, warns dramatic action is needed over the next 12 years to hold global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, beyond which global crises could unfold at a rapid pace. The report comes as Governor Rick Scott has declared Florida a state of emergency as forecasters predict Tropical Storm Michael could strengthen to become a major hurricane as it makes landfall late
Wednesday. This is before, in fact, it made landfall. And not only did it strengthen from a Category 3 to a Category 4 and almost to a Category 5, it was a high Category 4 by the time it hit land, but it had a devastating impact far inland up through several states until it exited the American coastline over the Carolinas. Not predicted, but anticipated by the governor of Florida, who indicated a state of emergency even before landfall. Well, this is the kind of thing that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been warning about for the last 30 years. Since it was first set up. And the report now is appreciated globally, if not in the United States.
This week, a scientific panel of the United Nations issued a landmark report on climate change. It was compiled by more than 90 scientists from 40 countries, and it warns of a potential crisis due to global warming that could hit by 2040. So, is time running out to save the planet, and what actions do the scientists recommend to prevent a climate catastrophe? We begin with this report from CGTN correspondent Lilling Tan.
The world is warming at a faster rate than previously thought, and drastic measures are needed to cool it down, according to the new widely cited climate study. The report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that the 2-degree target set by the Paris Climate Accord of 2015 does not go far enough. Instead, the world needs to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees within 12 years.
There would be 420 million people less suffering because of climate change if we would be able to limit the warming to 1.5 degree level, and we have certain areas in the world which are extremely sensitive. It's the small island states, Mediterranean region, and also sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay. Now, this gentleman is the head of the World Meteorological Association, WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, which is the UN organization that looks over the whole global weather circumstance. And he's the one that's emphasizing that there are vulnerable countries, largely in island nations around the Mediterranean and in sub-Saharan Africa. These countries are going to feel it immediately. They already feel the effects of climate change.
Which are already suffering and will suffer the most.
Today, the Earth has already warmed to 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which means there's only about a half degree to go. Half a degree that could separate hope from catastrophe caused by extreme weather, wildfires, droughts and floods, food scarcity, and widespread poverty. The study involved 91 scientists from 40 countries, analyzing over 6,000 scientific sources. It found that the difference of half a degree could halve the rate of habitat loss for animals, insects, and plants, significantly reduce coral reef destruction, and slow down the melting of Arctic sea ice. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is technically possible, say the authors of the report, but it may be politically challenging, especially when major greenhouse gas emitting countries are not on board. The United States, for example, has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord, and Brazil may elect a president who plans to do the same. Climate scientists say deeper cuts in greenhouse gas emissions are needed, as well as more investment in clean energy. A whopping $2.4 trillion in clean energy every year for the next 17 years to be exact, while also cutting the use of coal-fired power to nearly zero by 2050.
This is our challenge. We produce today 85% of the global energy based on fossil energy, coal, oil and gas, and only 15% based on non-carbon sources, nuclear, hydro and renewable.
The scientists say it is now up to governments to decide whether to act. Li-Ling Tan, CGTN, New York.
Okay, it's now up to governments to decide whether to act, but the scientists have done their best in getting the information out there, not just recently, but over the last 30 years, in fact. And each iteration of their reports, the IPCC reports, have become more urgent and more driven by the notion of impending catastrophe for large numbers of people, hundreds of millions of people. Now this is occurring at the same time that the human population over those 30 years has increasingly moved towards the coasts. We've discussed this before. In effect, the human population has become marginalized in the sense that it's moved from the center of continents to the margins of continents at the same time that sea level is rising. That can't be a recipe for stability or sustainability. And that's what, in effect, is being looked at now in terms of exceeding the 1.5 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels. Now we've already increased it 1 degree centigrade from pre-industrial levels, and people like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the scientists that they represent are saying that the climate report understates the threat. Not just that it's bad, but it's even worse than they're telling you. Because their report, the IPCC report, is based on reading 6,000 published reports and summarizing them. Okay. But those 6,000 reports would have had been printed well before, and then read, well before the current information about such things as rapidly moving and very rapidly changing hurricane seasons, like the one we've just experienced, both on the East Coast with the Carolinas hit by Hurricane Florence, and in the record hurricane hitting the panhandle of Florida as a Category 4 hitting the mainland. If you take into account these more recent assessments of the hurricane season, people like Dr. Richard Alley of Penn State University have indicated that the estimates given by the IPCC, based on the reports that they had 3 years ago, which they had in order to review for this summary report, what's called the SR 15, Special Report 15. Those studies have been updated and, in a sense, outdated by the more urgent and recent material. And as Dr. Ali has pointed out, the warning is that it's horrifyingly possible that sea level rise will be 15 to 20 feet, not just 1 to 3 feet that was previously suggested. Now, if sea level rise comes in at that end of the estimation scale, all of humanity is in trouble, particularly the populations that have moved closer to the coast over the last 50 or even just 30 years since the warnings have been forthcoming. James Hansen, who's referred to here by the Guardian newspaper as a climate guru, warns of much worse than expected sea level rise. The former NASA researcher and father of climate change awareness says melting of ice sheets could cause, quote, several meters rise in this century, swamping coastal cities. This is what he pointed out 30 years ago now to the United States Senate on the 23rd of June 1988 in very telling testimony. At the same time, others were coming forward and talking about the social impact of climate change, especially its impact on agriculture. Same year, 30 years ago, less than 3 months apart, James Hansen is talking to the Energy Committee and Dr. Weiskel talking to the Environment and Public Works Committee of the Senate. Since then, they've continued to publish, teach, and lecture on these issues. In fact, James Hansen's written a book with a very telling title to it called Storms of My Grandchildren, underscoring the instabilities that are coming down to meet us and the entire generation of his grandchildren. Dr. Weiskel published Environmental Decline in Public Policy, looking at the pattern, trend, and prospect for stability, and warned of an overshoot and collapse syndrome that we may well be launched upon. Dr. Hansen now directs, after leaving NASA, retiring from NASA work, now directs the program on climate science awareness and solutions at Columbia University's Earth Institute, and has a very productive second career beyond those 30 years of warnings he gave us from NASA. Dr. Weiskel went on to teach the Harvard University Extension School a course called Global Climate Change, the Science, Social Impact, and Diplomacy of a World Environmental Crisis. He co-taught this with another member of that same committee panel that met with the Energy Committee and Dr. Hansen, Professor William Mumma, formerly from Tufts University. And after teaching that for 21 semesters, he's added online teaching about climate vulnerability with online training for civic engagement. The issue is whether people can get out there and do something about this, especially in the face of no public leadership. Jim Hansen's been very articulate about this for a long time. It's worth remembering, as you'll see in this picture, he's standing in front of the White House just before he's arrested, not in protesting President Trump, but in protesting against the lack of policy from President Obama on tar sands, the complete lack of leadership from the Obama administration to stop definitively the use of non-conventional fuels was, for James Hansen, an indication of the total collapse of public leadership. Take a look.
Well, the point is to try to get the public aware of what's going on. The importance of tar sands is that it's the first step, first big step into unconventional fossil fuels. And what we know from the science is we cannot burn the unconventional fossil fuels and put the carbon into the atmosphere without leaving our children and grandchildren in a situation that's out of their control. It's a big deal. The science is very clear that we're already, with conventional oil and gas, we're putting the amount of CO2 up to the danger zone. We can still solve that problem if we phase out coal emissions over the next few decades and if we leave tar sands in the ground. But the fossil fuel companies are just ignoring that. They're assuming we can develop all that stuff. We can't. The science is crystal clear, and the president should understand that. And he should be, as a representative of the people, he should be moving the system in the direction of clean energies. And that doesn't mean the kind of green jobs that he was talking about. The simple fact is that as long as fossil fuels are the cheapest energy, then regardless of what you do with green energies, we're going to keep burning the fossil fuels. So you have to put a price on carbon to make the fossil fuels pay their cost to society.
Put a price on carbon fuels so that they pay the cost to society. In other words, make sure that they're not getting a free ride. They're using the atmosphere as a dump. They're making profits, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades, and they're preventing any effort to try to slow down the mechanisms of climate change. Now, he was truly a grassroots global visionary in this sense. He was arrested for the kinds of things he was saying in front of the White House and elsewhere, but he's the one who has the global vision, and he started a whole group of people working on these kinds of things, from grassroots to global efforts. Bill McKibben himself took inspiration from Jim Anson's work and extended it through a kind of worldwide movement through the 350.org as a grassroots global leadership fellow. In addition, other people joined in, like Gus Speth, the dean of the Yale Forestry School, standing there shoulder to shoulder with Bill McKibben, and got himself arrested as well in front of the White House. In effect, as a culture, both under Obama and Trump, we've been criminalizing the best and the brightest. Gus Speth is a very clear example of this, a stellar leader, a Rhodes Scholar, who came back and set up the Natural Defense Resources Council, NRDC. Went on to work for UNDP, United Nations Development Program. But he realized we weren't doing enough, and we had to resort to direct action. Others with grassroots leadership and global vision included Ross Gelbspan, a fantastic, important Boston Globe reporter who kept in front of the world the urgency of the issue. Dr. William Mumma himself co-taught the course at the Harvard Extension School for years and years, and people like Kumi Naidu from Greenpeace International had the same kind of grassroots and global vision. Tim DeChristopher, who's actually spent time in jail working on these issues. All of these things have stimulated people like the Rhodes Scholars to warn of the dramatic transformations required that are coming down the pike here because of what we're doing. Well, the greatest hoax, as it was referred to by President Trump and others, has struck Florida in an amazing hurricane. What about New York City? Where's the citizens update? What about Miami? Where's the citizens update? Where's citizens update for Washington, D.C., or Philadelphia, or Providence, or San Francisco? You can notice all of these cities are on the water and are in trouble. Los Angeles, citizens update for Baltimore, Portland. Fortunately, there is a citizens update for Boston. And in fact, it started to occur on YouTube. Get in touch with it. A new kind of citizen science alliance is emerging to devise a just transition to a sustainable future.